So when we talk about the double impact imposter syndrome, we're talking about the fact that internally you feel like an imposter, and then externally there are signals in the environment that are telling you you don't belong. And so oftentimes individuals from historically marginalized populations get these messages that you don't necessarily fit the particular description of who we expect to be in that seat.
Hi, Iris.
Hi, Whitney.
Welcome to the podcast where we acknowledge that the ways we are working really aren't working anymore.
We invite you into conversations with thought leaders, coaches, and industry experts to explore strategies for living with more ease and less grind, more flow and less fight. Welcome to Untrained.
Hi, Iris.
Hi, Whitney. We have a great guest today, and we've had his business partner and his partner in life on as well, Dr. Lisa Orbé-Austin. But today we have Dr. Richard Orbé-Austin is a psychologist and a founding partner of Dynamic Transitions Psychology Consulting, LLP, a career and executive coaching consultancy. Dr. Orbé-Austin has worked in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion and executive coaching for over 15 years. He was the founding director of NYU's Graduate Student Career Development Center. Prior to his tenure at NYU, Dr. Orbé-Austin served in a variety of leadership roles, including as the Chief Diversity Officer at Baruch College City, University of New York, and as the president of the New York Association of Black Psychologists. And Whitney is holding up two books that he's co-authored. And I'll just say, in his practice, Dr. Orbé-Austin works with executive senior leaders and mid-career professionals to identify their best fit career options, advance their career goals, and strengthen their leadership skills, and relationship skills, probably. So he's a regular consultant to academic institutions, corporations, and nonprofit organizations on issues related to leadership, career development, transitions, diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racist practice, burnout, imposter syndrome, communication, and conflict. If you are on LinkedIn, I would definitely follow Dr. Orbé-Austin. He definitely writes wonderful newsletters, so please subscribe to his newsletters. And I've had an opportunity to work with you through your Unstoppable Greatness group sessions with you and Dr. Lisa Orbé-Austin. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And we're excited to have you, and there are a number of topics that we'd like to get to, so we're going to just dive right in. So One of the conversations you've been having a lot lately is about toxic workplace environments. And we've talked recently on this podcast about scarcity mindset and about career transitions. Toxic workplace environments is another lens from which it's valuable to look at our situation when we're deciding, do we stay or do we go or do we join? So could you talk to us a little bit about toxic workplace environments, how we know when we've done enough to try and change things and when it's just the environment, it's not going to work, when it's time to go?
Well, thank you for that question, Whitney, because to me, this is such a critical element. The pandemic really illuminated some of the challenges people faced in the workplace. Burnout became a very popular topic. This issue of toxic workplaces, though, was something that some people felt, they would just throw around relative to the actual meaning of it. But thankfully, the U.S. Surgeon General put out a report really defining what toxic workplaces consist of. And so it really talked about a couple of things. One, it's uninclusive. Two, it's unethical, it's abusive, and it's overly and unhealthily competitive. And so he clearly made recommendations to address this because his conclusion was that toxic workplaces are hazardous to our health. And that report really, I think, confirmed a lot of what I've been talking about relative to the fact that we spend so much time at work. And if it's in an unhealthy environment, it leaks into everything else that we do. So when you think about this question of, well, when do we decide whether to stay or leave? So many people feel trapped. They feel stuck. They feel like, well, I'm making a good enough salary. I've got a mortgage. I've got kids to put through school. I can take it. I've taken it for a long time, but they're suffering. And so part of what we want to be able to do, and the reason we wrote the second book, Your Unstoppable Greatness, is to really talk about the fact that when you get to a point of overcoming your imposter syndrome, if you are in a toxic work environment, it can trigger you back into an imposter state. And so we really wanted to give people tools to really understand how to overcome that. And so first and foremost, you want to understand what's making the work environment toxic to you, right? Is it a very unhealthy boss, like a bullying boss, or a boss who's so perfectionistic that you can't make any mistakes? Is it a narcissistic boss? Two, you want to figure out, how is that particular boss or environment impacting you? Do you have the Sunday scaries every day? Or is work always on your mind? Can you not enjoy yourself when you go on vacation? Like, what are the ways that it is adversely impacting your overall well-being? And then three, most importantly, is to really help you to understand that you will have options, that you don't need to be stuck. And if the job is wonderful and you feel like the only concern is that toxic boss, then you do have some options, right? That one, really thinking about allying with your colleagues to think about how actually to shift the culture. So if it's the boss that's making the culture toxic, really being able to think about, well, do we have a way as a collective to go to HR, to go to senior management to talk about some of these issues? If you feel isolated and you don't have that support, that's when it gets a little tricky, where you might want to think about, it's time to transition, right? Like, if you've tried to advocate for yourself, you went to HR, talked to senior leadership, there's no response, you still feel every Monday you don't want to go to work, you feel like you have these nightmares every night, that's what we're concerned about, that you should not have to live in such a toxic environment, that it isn't just a part of work. Work can be enjoyable, maybe not 100% of the time, but it should not be the thing that's causing you to suffer all the time.
We both did the inhale.
Yeah, we're like, inhale.
I was going to zoom out and say, just to clarify, if we want to figure out if it's our relationship to work that maybe isn't working well because we have imposter syndrome, or is it our relationship to this particular workplace? So how do we know, what are some indicators that we've done our work on our imposter syndrome and we're ready for a healthy relationship to work? What are some indicators of that, other than we've had a good work environment in the past?
Sure. So one of the key factors when we're thinking about imposter syndrome is how much are these automatic negative thoughts that are telling you you're not good enough, that you don't belong, keep popping up, right? The mind reading of saying, people think I'm not smart enough to be on this project. How much are you feeling like, I don't know if I have any skills or accomplishments? If you're able to really own your accomplishments, if the automatic negative thoughts have decreased, if you're able to feel like you don't need to be perfect to show that you belong, then it demonstrates that you've done a good job of overcoming your imposter syndrome. But that if you're in an environment that is saying to you, you must be perfect, you need to overwork to be rewarded, and you begin to feel triggered again and saying, I did think that I was good enough, and now this environment is telling me something else. That's the difference, right? That it's the environment, that it's not you that's causing you to feel that way.
I think it's, for me, I'm reflecting on myself and some of my other clients. It's a yes I was working on my own imposter syndrome and working in an environment that didn't necessarily, wasn't a place I felt like I belonged. So it isn't just let me work on myself and then see what happens. It's kind of having to parse out what's the environment and what do I need to work on, what's being triggered. So that's, in all honesty, that's why I reached out to Lisa to begin with, because I couldn't tell, like, what is it, me or is it them? And sometimes I'm like, am I creating this problem? So there was this sort of mixed upness of feeling like, I don't know where this is coming from. So where do you start with someone like that?
So could you either give some examples of people you've worked with or workplace environments you've worked with?
Sure. So I will say that it is messy because of the fact that you, one, may not even know that what you're experiencing is imposter syndrome. right? And so if you don't have a name for it and you just feel like, oh, I'm in this job and I always feel like someone's going to come to me and say, you don't belong here, you're not smart enough, you're not good enough. Once you understand that it's imposter syndrome, then you almost can take a look back and say, well, these feelings that I've had, is it only in this work environment or has it been in other places? And then really thinking through how to actually move forward and being able to send different messages to yourself. And so I'll talk both about, clients that I've worked with, but also organizations to really reduce, if you will, imposter syndrome triggering types of environments. And so on the client end, I remember having a particular client who was very successful, as always, a lawyer, feeling like, she can do the work, but she always felt like there was something missing, that she was not as competitive or as smart as her colleagues. And so when we really began to peel back the layers and started thinking about, well, where might this have come from? It was really about her family of origin, where she felt like, she had an older sister who was, deemed the smart one, if you will. And she got sent the message that she just needed to work really, really hard. And ultimately, she never felt like she was that smart, even though her grades were very comparable to the one who was identified as the smart one. And so that message continued on through, college and law school. And when she got into a law firm, where she started to realize that it was impacting her ability to be satisfied and as successful as she wanted to, because she was racked by these feelings of imposterism, where she didn't want to ask for more challenging projects. She didn't want to, raise her hand or talk about some things that were going wrong on a particular case, because she didn't want to then feel like, oh, they're going to think it's me and I'm not good enough. So our work really helped her to identify the origins of the story, the narrative she told herself about who she was, helped her to really own her accomplishments and her skill sets, and then ultimately recognizing that she not only belonged, but she had the right to actually advance. And so that, I think, was a particular case of really being able to work hand in hand to understand her imposter syndrome, but also the environment in which she worked. So, when we talk about particular environments and organizations, a lot of organizations recently, especially after and during the pandemic, would come in and say, oh, my employees feel overworked, they feel burnt out, and all these other things are happening. And so I would come in and do a piece of work with them to talk about, well, yes, they are burnt out, but let's talk about what are some of the things contributing to that burnout. Burnout culture characteristics. So rewarding overwork, making it feel like everything is high stakes, not evaluating them so everyone feels on edge because they don't know if they're doing good work because no one tells them otherwise. Feeling like the only way for you to succeed is at the detriment of your actual colleagues. All those elements will cause imposter syndrome to flare back up, because it feels like, I don't know if I'm good enough because no one is telling me. They're telling me I need to overwork. They're telling me I need to be perfect. And so it's intervening with organizations to really talk about how employees can be productive, but they don't necessarily need to be sent these messages that are unhealthy for them and unhealthy ultimately for the organization.
One of the things I've heard you talk about on other podcasts is when your boss has imposter syndrome and how that may be leading to a toxic work environment. What shows up there when your boss has imposter syndrome, and what are those behaviors?
So one of the first behaviors that I point out is micromanagement. So because they feel like you are a representation of them, and if you make a mistake, then it will reflect on them and they will be exposed as a fraud. And so they tend to micromanage every piece of work. At the same time, they also may find it difficult to make decisions. And so because of the fact that if they don't think they can make a perfect decision, they may hesitate to make any decision. And so they leave their team confused oftentimes as to what direction to go in. They also are the individuals that may reward overwork, because they feel like the only way for them and for the team to really ultimately succeed is to overwork so they can prove that they belong. So those are some of the primary characteristics when a boss is dealing with imposter syndrome, because they are so concerned about not being exposed that they leave it, it negatively influences their team members.
What can you do if you're someone who has this boss? I wonder if the answer is it depends, right? Like, depends on the relationship to the boss or who they are. I get that. But are there things that we can do to manage that relationship?
Well, in the best case scenario, if there is a relationship there and you may be experiencing some of the similar things, say you're also dealing with imposter syndrome, you can say, hey, I found this great book around this issue called imposter syndrome. I don't know if you've ever heard about it, but I've been working through it. And, I thought it was something that might be useful for us to talk about. Right. And so it's opening up space, not saying, oh, I think you have imposter syndrome too, but it's opening up space for them to, one, again, know that there's a name to some of what they might be experiencing. Ultimately, if the relationship is not there, then it is this challenge of managing up, right? And so if you have a boss who's dealing with, some of these issues and they're micromanaging, it's you being proactive to make sure that you clearly set an agenda when you're working with them. So if you're working on a project, even before they can micromanage, you set out a game plan as to how you're going to accomplish that project. Make sure you're doing check-ins periodically, ask for it, so that they don't necessarily feel concerned about what you're up to. And then also being able to model, even though they might not necessarily respect the boundary, being able to model having boundaries, right? Not overworking, being able to make sure you're getting the job done, but also being able to take time off and not respond to every email and phone call while you're away. That you might feel like, well, I have to respond. It's my boss. Before you go on vacation, you say, hey, here's everything that needs to be taken care of. Here's the plan of action. If a real emergency comes up, you can reach out to me, but everything's taken care of. And here's the backup person that you can talk to while I'm away. Again, in the best case scenario, you have that colleague, you already set up a game plan to really be able to manage up any concerns so that you can be left to your own devices and actually have some peace while you're on vacation.
I really appreciate this language because I've just been lumping these behaviors into like, oh, your boss sounds like a narcissist, right? And very often people, you've mentioned this, who have imposter syndrome are people pleasers. So people pleasers show up to relationships and they want to connect, right? But if you have a boss with imposter syndrome or a narcissistic boss, they're not looking to connect. So you really need to show up, as you said, managing the situation with lots of boundaries and really appropriate expectations. This is not a place to connect. This is a place to have transactions and to manage the situation better. So I appreciate adding that to my repertoire of language and how to understand it. And I think one of the things that's so empowering is to realize, oh, it's not me. It's not something wrong with me. It's this imposter syndrome, which, was created because of my external environment. And I've sort of internalized these mirrors. It's not me. Or my boss has imposter syndrome. It's not me. So that's where I think we can gain a lot of health. We can gain a lot of perspective and we can gain a lot of choice. And as you said, like, toxic workplaces are bad for our health. So we need to find places to start to externalize the toxicity and externalize this view of ourselves that leaves us on the hedonic treadmill and having negative thoughts. That's sort of my tee up to how I'm thinking of externalizing this. And a lot of the workbook is helping people to externalize this. But from your seat, kind of with the bird's eye view of both individuals and systems, how else do you coach people on externalizing all this imposter syndrome ick? That's a clinical term.
I know it very well. I appreciate that, Winnie. So I just think that what you said is so powerful. Of someone simply saying it's not me can be such a breakthrough moment. And I say this especially if someone who's been raised in, say, a codependent type of a system or a household environment where they feel like they've been taking on the responsibility for whatever may go wrong in the family, right? So if they are in a codependent, family, or if they have a narcissistic, caregiver that ultimately they always feel like, oh, maybe I did something wrong, or it is me. That's why this person is displeased and I need to do everything I can to please them. And so being able to coach people to recognize how to take appropriate accountability and how to actually then give that other piece to where it belongs in the external environment. So some people take no responsibility, and these tend to be the narcissists, and these are not people we're talking about who say everything is everyone else's fault. People with imposter syndrome oftentimes take all the responsibility, even though it's never all their fault. And so the more we can parse that out and say, okay, well, what could you have done differently? What's in your control versus what are some other factors that are outside of your control that will impact your ability to be successful, and how do we engage and intervene on those factors as well? And so this, it's not me, I think is such a powerful statement to really help them to reflect upon the fact that they are not the ones solely responsible for all the things that may have occurred to them or around them.
I'm sort of getting a flashback. It was a breakthrough moment with Lisa when I was like, oh, I'm not causing the problems. Because I think as also someone who has imposter syndrome and as a people pleaser, it's almost like there's a vacuum or a void. And I'm like, oh, I'll just step into it and I'll fix it and it'll be fine, right? For various reasons. And then you step into that role and you realize, oh, well, I'm not causing these issues and I really need to build better boundaries around this. I think that really helped me in that moment of like, oh, wait, this is the environment that's causing this vacuum where I'm stepping in and helping to fix something that isn't fixable. And it's not even my problem to fix. So, yeah. Yeah, I'm not, this is not my problem to fix. And letting go of that, it does take time. I mean, there's so many things that wrap you up in there. And I wanted to actually bring up, Whitney, when we were discussing, you had a case or a client that you wanted to talk about. And I wanted to tee that up for you because I thought that was very interesting when we talked about it.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple clients who fit this profile, but it's a client, you call it double impact imposter syndrome, Richard, which is where you have a client, maybe they're the first in their family to go to college. Maybe they're the first in the family to enter corporate America. Maybe and of course, then they're the first in the family to enter the top rungs of corporate America. And each time this happens, they get another round of imposter syndrome. Whereas ideally they'd be going, oh my Lord, I have accomplished amazing things, but they have the inverse response. So could you talk to us about that?
Sure. So when we talk about the double impact imposter syndrome, we're talking about the fact that internally, you feel like an imposter, and then externally, there are signals in the environment that are telling you you don't belong. And so oftentimes individuals from historically marginalized populations get these messages that you don't necessarily fit the particular description of who we expect to be in that seat. And therefore, as you said, if you're the only one or the first one, you don't have role models to even be able to say, what was this like for you? Like, how do I navigate this? And so you're getting these messages both from yourself internally and then whatever types of biases or discrimination are in the environment that are telling you that you're not good enough or you have to work even harder than everyone else to prove to us that you belong here. And that takes a toll.
It does.
Relative to increased levels of stress, increased levels of anxiety and depressive symptoms. And so that double impact is real relative to how you are able to overcome it so that you can actually live the type of life you deserve to live and want to live.
And the higher they go, often there's fewer people that look like them.
Right. And the higher they go, the more intense that feeling may be. So oftentimes we may feel like, oh, they'll get to a point where they feel like, I've made it, right? I'm at the upper echelons of whatever aspect or whatever profession. But that's not the case, because the higher up you go, the more you then feel like, to your point, there's no one that looks like me around here or has my experience. And so maybe I don't belong, right? And so those imposter feelings and the double impact may intensify rather than decrease.
And that's often when they have to perform. They have to perform to go through these steps to get, these positions. And there's just this generalized anxiety. There's imposter syndrome, whatever you want to call it, which makes it harder for them to show up authentically and to perform with confidence. So how do you coach individuals who are in those situations?
So one of the things that I talk about first and foremost is to acknowledge what is happening to them, right? And so we talk about what this double impact is, and then helping them deal with their own imposter syndrome and those negative, again, internal messages on one end, and then being able to recognize that they do need support in their environment. And so whether it's finding mentors, whether it's finding sponsors, whether it's finding professional associations where you can really connect with and talk to people who have shared experiences with some of what you're dealing with, to help them to see that they're not alone. Because oftentimes when they feel like they're alone, then they feel like, well, there's a reason someone like me doesn't make it this far, because maybe I shouldn't be here. And so maybe I should opt out. But then when they see that that's not the case, there are other people who've had some similar experiences, and here's how they've navigated it, helping them to then see that they can also navigate it is such a powerful moment in the coaching work, for them to feel like I do deserve where I am and I want to even climb higher.
I love that. And I appreciate that message so much, because I think also part of the internal habitual response is I need to hide how vulnerable I feel.
Mm-hmm. Right. Like they suffer in silence, and which is one of the reasons that imposter syndrome oftentimes is sustained, because they're too embarrassed to admit what they're experiencing. And so they sit with it on their own.
I can imagine it's even more pronounced in the remote environment, right? Because you go into a meeting and then you're not interacting with anyone on just like a connectivity level of talk. Everything is transactional. You close the laptop and then all you have is your thoughts about yourself. So I can imagine, do you see that? Do you see that there sometimes is like more maybe pronouncement of this imposter syndrome because of the remote environment?
Yeah, and one of the things that I talk about is, I am first and foremost a proponent of the remote environment, but I do talk about the fact that, especially for those who are transitioning into a new environment or a new workplace, or if they're just out of college, there's a disadvantage because they're not able to build up the social capital they need, the relationships that they need and want to really be able to help them to overcome their imposter syndrome, because they're only seeing people in squares all the time. And to your point, everyone then runs to the next, virtual meeting. There's no opportunity to build the relationships that we all naturally built when we were in the office. And so to me, having some level of a hybrid environment is helpful to those populations, because if you're starting remotely, or if you only work remotely, then it's difficult to form the emotional connections and bonds, right? That people see you, respect you, but there's something lost in feeling like, you know what, I want to actually go to lunch with Iris and talk a little bit more about what she's doing. And if I'm able to do that, then I will deepen my connection to Iris, and then naturally I want to help her, right? And so I think that's the thing that oftentimes I see, that being able to negotiate that reality is something that I oftentimes talk to clients about.
I want to use this to pivot into a topic that you've been talking about a lot. It's Mental Health Awareness Week, DE&I, mental health and wellness. So what is it that's important that you've been having conversations around this topic?
So I've been someone who's been talking about DEI probably for over 20 years. It was some of the work that I did in my academic training, and then subsequently the work that I do in my consulting practice. And oftentimes when people hear diversity, equity, inclusion, some of the reasons, particularly that people feel like they should pursue a DEI initiative, is that it's a good business case, right? That what we find in the research are that more diverse teams are more productive financially for institutions. So that is helpful. So some people say, well, let's think about the business case for DEI. Others will say, well, what about the moral case? It's just the right thing to do to be more inclusive and more equitable. These past few years, the backlash against DEI has said, yeah, we don't really care about either of those things, right? We feel like people who don't deserve to be in certain places are getting advantaged in ways that are not fair. So this backlash has built up because there's been many misconceptions about diversity, equity, inclusion and what its main purpose is. And so ultimately, to me, the frame that I've been using to really talk to people recently is that diversity, equity, inclusion ultimately is about making sure that everyone in the workplace feels seen, heard, respected, valued, and ultimately feels like they have a place at the table. And it's hard to me to argue that. But going further, what I talk about is the whole purpose of it is to make sure that no one is harmed in their day-to-day interactions at work. And so when I talk about the fact that I'm now saying, look, ultimately DEI is about wellness, that if someone comes into an environment and does not feel seen or heard or has to deal with microaggressions or, sexist comments or racist comments, that it does have an impact on their overall well-being, both from a mental health standpoint and a physical health standpoint. So, for instance, some of the research talks about the fact that having racist experiences increases inflammation in African Americans, which can result in, heart issues, other physical health issues. That experiencing microaggressions, be it gender, be it racial, be it any other, has an impact with elevated stress, anxiety, and depressive symptoms. So it's not just an abstract concept of, oh, yeah, we're trying to get, we're trying to be politically correct and do all these things to change the workplace. It's more of, no, we want everyone to feel like I can be safe in what it is that I'm doing, and I can feel good in my work environment. And so, again, to me, going back to your Surgeon General, being able to say toxic workplaces that are uninclusive are hazardous to our health, that's the framework, right? That inclusion is about wellness, and that ultimately, if we take it up from that lens, again, it's hard to argue with saying that you want all of your employees to feel well, right? To feel mentally healthy, to feel physically healthy so that they can be productive, so they can be retained. That's what I'm really trying to advocate organizations see in this period where DEI has come under so much intense attack.
And what kind of response are you getting from organizations? Because sort of as it's become obvious just in the conversation that a lot of the behaviors of imposter syndrome are benefiting some workplaces, right? And that environments where belonging is a top priority, again, sometimes people's belief around high performance creates environments that don't have a lot of sense of belonging. So what kind of feedback, what kind of impact are you noticing?
So I'm noticing, thankfully, a pretty good impact, because I think the pandemic allowed us to have more conversations about mental well-being, particularly burnout. So that was something time and again, organizations came to me to talk about how to help their employees deal with that. And so it was an opening now to really have more expansive conversations about other things that impact their employees' mental well-being. And so when we talk about burnout and when we talk about microaggressions, when we talk about bias, it's more of these are some of the things that are causing your workers to not feel as productive or as healthy as they could possibly be. And so that, I think, is something that hopefully we continue to see momentum around, as we saw with burnout.
Can you talk a little bit about if I'm a leader listening and thinking, how do I keep DEI top of mind? How do I keep belonging and connection top of mind? What are some behaviors or things I can do as a leader, as I'm leading my team, to help the members of the team feel like they're connected and belong to the group?
Sure. So I think the first thing you need to do is to ask the question of what is the environment that you have created? And so many leaders are reluctant to do any kind of climate surveys to really understand what's going on because they don't really want to know the truth. They feel like anything that's going wrong in their mind would be an indictment of them. And so to protect their egos, they don't ask the question. And so the first thing you need to do is to really be able to strengthen your ego and launch a climate survey, launch some focus groups to really talk about, well, what are some of the things that people are telling me need to be different in the environment that we've created? Once you understand that, then you'll understand what types of interventions you really need to create for the benefit of your workers. Like one of the studies that I cite continually, which was mind blowing to me, 2021 Future Forum did a survey to ask workers about hybrid work versus remote work. What were some of the reasons they'd want to stay remote? 97% of Black employees surveyed said the reason they want to stay remote is because they do not want to deal with the microaggressions they experience on a day-to-day basis. 97%. That's enough. That's a number that blew my head. It continues to blow my head. Wow. Right. And so if 97% of your employees are saying this is the reason that I don't want to come to work, then that might be something you might want to address, because it's clearly impacting their ability to feel connected and engaged in the workplace and to feel heard and respected and valued. So I think it's more of the same, whether it's, women and some of the experiences that they had, whether it's LGBT employees and some of the experiences that they're having, understanding what is happening in your environment and then being able to commit to and invest in interventions, not say, oh, now we know what's wrong. That's great. And maybe we'll try to do something here and there. You actually have to put money into it to shift culture.
I'm waiting for you, Whitney, because I wanted to actually ask, because we talked about before, the word covering or masking is coming up, and I don't know a ton about it. So I wanted to get educated about it. When we're talking about DEI, it does come up. So what is masking or covering, and what does that mean?
Sure. So in 2006, Kenji Yoshino, who's a legal scholar, wrote a book called Covering, and really talked about this experience of individuals who are, in essence, masking or covering their identities so that they can feel that they fit or belong in the particular environment. And so, for instance, it might be an LGBTQ employee not putting up pictures of his family so that they don't necessarily then feel like people will wonder, what their sexual orientation is. It may be a woman coming to work and not wearing her wedding ring because, everyone else there is single, and there are expectations about when women get married that then they will have kids and then they will leave. So it's feeling like you need to conform to the norms by hiding aspects of your identity. So masking it, covering it in order to feel that you can stay or belong in a certain environment.
I think about some people maybe thinking, well, I wondered about one of my clients, and she actually was glad to be remote because she wanted to mask that she was pregnant. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting because I had a conversation with her, and she was like, well, I just don't want them to know, right? Because it actually, I think about and maybe I'm mixing things together of, is she authentically showing up or not? And what is that like? And it's really messy, right? So I think of the word authenticity too, and showing up, and all of those are loaded words for me. So maybe I'm mixing covering and authenticity together, or maybe there's not something there, but I'm still in this sort of exploration phase because just to say, I think there's a lot out there on Instagram and TikTok on authenticity and covering. And I just want us to be clear about those words, what they mean, how does it feel, and how do people actually experience this?
And navigate them.
Yeah, and I don't think you're not necessarily, the two are related, right? And so you're not messing things up or blurring the lines. I think that, when you're covering or masking, you're not able to be your authentic self for fear of what might happen if you do. And so oftentimes where people say, well, I can't bring my authentic self to work, it's the reality of saying I can't share particular aspects of who I am at work. But I also, caution that a lot of what we do at work and the self that shows up at work cannot necessarily always align with the self that we show in other places, right? That to some extent it's performative. right? Because our actual selves may just want to hang out in like sweatpants and, drink, latte today. Maybe we can't do that, right? And so there's a fine line there of like being able to say, what it means to be authentic. But again, if you're feeling like, and particularly, and I talk about this oftentimes, unfortunately, to this day with my women clients, that is a big concern, right? That if you are found to be pregnant, there are costs to that still, right? That
Yes.
there's automatically this notion of, oh, okay, what's now going to happen? Is she going to come back, or is she going to be as focused on the work? And so working moms suffer a penalty consistently. And I've worked in environments where someone has said to me, who's a woman, who would say, I don't want to hire women of childbearing age because of fear that they will leave. And she said this to me, like right in the open, right? And I'm thinking to myself, what are you doing? But this is really a major concern. And so when your client is saying, yeah, I don't want them to know, and I'm glad I'm remote, she's right about it, because there's more than likely a risk that will happen if she's able, her authentic self should be able to say, hey, I'm pregnant. People should be able to say, oh, congratulations, what have you. But we know that oftentimes that's not going to happen, right? They may outwardly say congratulations, but they're already starting to calculate, okay, well, what will this mean for the business? Right. Mm-hmm. And how do we, then trust that she's going to come back? How do we trust that when she does come back, that her attention is not going to be split now between her family and us? And women continue to pay a price that men don't in the work environment relative to that, where working fathers get benefits still and working mothers get the penalty.
I feel like this could be a whole topic in and of itself. But for those of you, for our audience who's been nodding along as we've been having this conversation and want to learn more from you, either through individual work or group work, or just engaging with you more in this conversation on LinkedIn, how can we find you?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me also on Instagram, Dr. Rich Orbé-Austin. And, certainly if you'd want to have further conversations or work with me, you can go to my website, dynamictransitionsllp.com, as well as pick up the books that I've co-authored, Own Your Greatness, that really talks through a model to overcome imposter syndrome. And then Your Unstoppable Greatness, which really talks about really holding on to your career dreams, how to sustain yourself in toxic work environments, how to overcome burnout and perfectionism.
So many topics, so many important topics, and I'm so glad that you joined us today. And there's just so much that I've learned today. Iris, what do you want to add or ask as we close out?
Well, I'm adding that I have been a recipient of the group work and the individual work with the Orbé-Austins, and I cannot tell you how big a difference it's made in my life, and continues to be, because I still meet with Lisa on a regular basis. So I think we talk about this a lot, is this untraining the idea that you can just grit and grind through something by yourself, that you can just get the book and then move on with your life. I think it's really important to understand you need people, and there are people out there that want to help you, and that help is so important and will be a big part of your change and your shift in your life, and will make a big difference. And I definitely give you both credit for helping me get to the place where I am now, and continue to grow. So it's really just an advertisement for them, because it's so important. And so many of us say the words imposter syndrome, but you have two people who have studied it, have been through it, and have two books and workbooks that can really shift and change your life. So please, if you feel this way, feel like you might have imposter syndrome, please reach out. That's all I have to say about that.
Well, I will echo having a front row seat to Iris's life, watching how much has changed and how impactful it has been. And also wanting to echo how valuable it is to externalize imposter syndrome and all the things that we've been talking about today, and not carry it around inside you. And that takes a team, and that takes other people. So just encouraging people to take an action if you're resonating with this podcast.
Well, if you like
Iris.
if you like what you hear, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or anywhere where you get your podcasts. And we want to thank you, Dr. Rich Orbé-Austin, for joining us today. And what do we say at the end of every podcast, Whitney?
Keep untraining.
Keep untraining.